In the summer of 1943, the United States had more steel, more factories, and more workers than any nation in history, and it was still running out of bullets. Not because ships were being sunk, not because the mines had run dry. The War Department needed close to 2 billion rounds a month to keep two fronts supplied, and American plants were falling almost 1 billion rounds short, month after month. Marines in the Pacific were told to ration live fire in training. Infantry preparing for Sicily counted rounds like they were rationing food. The shortage wasn't a shortage of material, it was a shortage of seconds, bleeding away one workstation at a time, and almost nobody in Washington understood where those seconds were going. The answer came from a plant most Americans have never heard of, run under a system most Americans don't know existed. The government didn't build and staff its own ammunition factories. It owned the buildings and the machines, then handed the daily operation to private companies like Remington and Winchester under contract. It was called government-owned, Contractor-Operated, GOCO for short, a quiet piece of bureaucratic plumbing that let the country scale weapons production overnight without waiting for private industry to build from scratch. One of those GOCO plants sat outside Independence, Missouri, churning out small arms ammunition around the clock. And to staff it, the Ordnance Department ran its own recruitment campaign, separate from the famous Rosie the Riveter posters plastered across the aircraft industry. This one was called WOW, Women Ordnance Workers, and it pulled in tens of thousands of women who had never set foot in a factory, dropped them into 12-hour shifts, and asked them to run machines that could take a handoff at the wrist. What almost none of the recruitment posters showed was who actually worked the hardest, hottest stations on those lines. Many ordnance plants were informally segregated, even after a wartime order technically banned discrimination in defense hiring. Black women, many of them recent arrivals from Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana during the Great Migration, were disproportionately assigned to the most punishing and least visible jobs on the floor, and were even less likely than white co-workers to have their names recorded in a company newsletter or a supervisor's report. If the history of these plants already erased its women, it erased its black women twice over. On one of those lines stood a teenager we'll call Odessa Marsh, 19 years old, 3 months off a train from Mississippi, working the feeder table where raw brass casings had to be hand-aligned before they could be charged and crimped. It was the most delicate step in the entire operation, done by hand exactly the way it had been done in the last war. 6 women worked the table in tight, endless loops, pick, place, slide, thousands of times an hour. On a good hour, the line hoped for 30,000 fed casings. Most hours it stalled near 23,000. Multiply that gap across every line, every hour, every plant running day and night, and it becomes millions of missing rounds a day. And the cause was almost insultingly small. One slipped grip, one jammed guide rail, one broken fingernail. The whole sequence froze, and every stoppage cost seconds nobody could get back. One morning a guide rail snapped, and casings scattered across the concrete. While the women stepped back, and mechanics scrambled, Odessa knelt to gather the spilled brass, and watched the motion of the resuming line differently than she had before. The wrists weren't moving in a line at all, they were looping, the shoulders rotating, an orbit disguised as a straight path. And that's when a memory surfaced, not from a textbook, but from home. A cane mill her family had used to press syrup from sorghum stalks. A wheel that turned continuously while cane was fed in from one side and juice came out the other. No stopping, no resetting, just rotation carrying the work forward on its own rhythm. She was a teenager with no drafting table and no authority to change anything on a war production line. But the thought wouldn't leave her. What if the casings didn't move in a row at all? What if a wheel carried them, the way the mill wheel had carried cane, feeding several stations at once, instead of forcing everything through one narrow bottleneck by hand? Getting anyone to look at a scrap bin sketch, built by the least senior worker on the floor, was its own battle. She scavenged a bent bracket and a discarded bearing ring, laid wooden slats around it, behind a stack of crates, and pictured casings riding in shallow notches around the rim. A mechanic found her there and asked one question: "What problem are you actually trying to solve?" When she said throughput, he stopped smiling, because throughput was a language every person on that floor understood, whether or not they believed a teenager could fix it. They got 3 minutes and a strip of floor beside line 2 to bolt a wooden mock-up onto a spindle and see what happened. It wobbled, spun too fast, and threw casings across the bench like scattered marbles. The women laughed, not unkindly, at a wheel that clearly did not work yet, but the mechanic slowed the rotation and steadied it, and when Odessa set 3 casings into the notches, one fed cleanly, one corrected itself against the guide lip, and one dropped almost exactly where it should. Nothing about that run was a success. It was proof the idea made sense, and a production line desperate enough for extra rounds was willing to bet a night shift on proof. Engineers already had a name for the underlying concept, even if nobody on that floor used it: a star wheel, an indexing device that rotates parts past multiple stations instead of pushing them through one at a time, borrowed from bottling and canning lines built decades earlier. Overnight, the maintenance crew cut a steel version nearly 2.5 feet across, lined its slots with rubber stripped from truck tires to kill vibration, because in a plant where shaking machinery ruined good ideas as fast as heat did, weight and stillness were the whole point. When it finally spun, it fed 19 of 20 casings cleanly on the first run, and by morning the typical feed rate on that station, normally under 500 casings a minute, pushed past 700, then 8, within the hour. Within 6 months the design had spread to ordnance plants across the country, refined by engineers with far more training than a teenager who had never touched a drafting table. But the underlying idea never changed: rotation instead of a line, a wheel instead of a row, a system built to work with human fatigue instead of grinding against it. By the time American troops hit the beaches at Normandy, ammunition rationing on the production side had quietly ended. Almost none of them ever learned that part of their firepower traced back to a sorghum mill remembered by a teenage migrant worker on a factory floor in Missouri. Odessa Marsh is a stand-in, a name for thousands of women and disproportionately thousands of black women whose specific contributions were never written down at all, not in a company newsletter, not in a WOW recruitment poster, not anywhere. They didn't get medals. Most of them didn't even get their names remembered by the plants they helped save. But they proved that the arsenal of democracy wasn't built by the men whose names ended up in the history books. It was built by workers close enough to a broken system to feel it in their own hands, who refused to accept that the numbers on a counter couldn't be changed.